Hi everyone. In this video I want to talk through how you should be thinking about completing the final section of Project 1, the reflection section where I ask you to think about what the writers of your articles might be trying to say about responsibility, or how we could interpret those articles as having something to say about responsible rhetoric or rhetorical responsibility. So while you watch this video, you may want to jot down some notes and then later on go back and look at the texts that I talk about so that you can be thinking about how to apply these concepts to writing the final section of your paper. So right now I have open the Project 1 assignment. I'm going to refer to that a few times. I also have here a map of the points that I'm going to talk through in this video. And so you might, like I note here, want to use this document to take notes. I'm going to post this document or a Microsoft Word version of it in the video page so that if you want to download it and edit it and jot down notes while you're watching the video, you can do that. So our first move is going to be to think about some definitions of responsible rhetoric. What does that even mean? Well, let's start by taking a look at the project description. I say here, what can it mean to be rhetorically responsible? How might I consider rhetorically responsible writing practices in my work? Our impetus to write begins with our reading of a scene, of a situation, of a text. It begins with a need to express an idea or communicate a course of action in response to a claim or request or absence. Okay, so our motivations for writing often begin with something that we are reading, either physically, like reading a text, or noticing or analyzing a situation. And then in here I talk about how rhetorical analysis helps us do that. In the final sentence, I say, considering the health of our communicative relationships with others, our peers, our coworkers, those in our social circles, we can also use rhetorical analysis to make responsible decisions about our writing. So one thing that we're doing in this project is using analysis to think about how we are maintaining relationships with our audience through our writing decisions. If you hear something that sounds like a monster in the background, it's my neighbor's sump pump, so it's pretty loud. Okay, so then we can move to the section on responsibility in the syllabus. So let's go ahead and pull that up. Okay, let's review some key ideas in this section. We've talked about it a little bit before. Responsibility is defined by the Framework for Success in Post-Secondary Writing as the ability to take ownership of one's actions and understand the consequences of those actions for oneself and others. So that notion of responsibility cuts across all aspects of our lives and deals with our decisions that we might make in our workplace, in our personal relationships, in the classroom, out in public, when we're driving. Here in these bullet points, we're thinking about responsibility as it relates to writing specifically and to the writing that you do as a college student. So you're going to be asked this semester to think about your own role in learning. You are going to be asked to operate on an understanding that learning is shared among the writer and others. So the others that you're working with, me, your classmates, maybe librarians and other support staff in the UGL or other places on campus that are working with you. And then as we move throughout the semester, we start to branch out from just thinking about our classroom into thinking about the fields or the publics that we're researching and writing and talking about. So maybe if you are researching something related to the environment, you're thinking about what people in environmental science or politics or green engineering are doing a lot of different groups or disciplines or communities that are interested in the topics that you're looking at. We're also, as writers, thinking about how we engage and incorporate the ideas of others and how we give credit to those ideas by using appropriate attribution. So one of the things that we talked about with Project 1 is using signal phrases to clearly reference when you are using the author's ideas. You're also going to follow the rules of MLA formatting to appropriately quote passages or sentences or phrases from authors and to include those citations in your work. But I also want us to kind of highlight this idea of consequences of those actions for oneself and others in terms of what that could mean when we make a rhetorical decision in our writing or in our speaking or in posting something online. We're thinking about responsibility in those kinds of venues where communication is central to what's happening and what happens when we choose to make a particular decision. How can we make decisions that take into account both what others need, what is respectful to others, but also decisions that will help reinforce and support a continuing developing relationship between us and those others. Okay, so that's a look at the syllabus. We can also draw from Patricia Roberts Miller's chapter on rhetoric, which you read this week. So let's jump over to that. So let's remember that the chapters in our textbook, Bad Ideas About Writing, have titles where the title is actually like the opposite or a different perspective than what the writer is arguing for. So here in her title, Rhetoric is Synonymous with Empty Speech, Patricia Roberts Miller is stating a commonly held bad idea about writing, and she goes on to write about how rhetoric means something different than that. And so I'm not going to completely break down the article, although you might find this article really useful to reference in your rhetorical analysis. I just want to highlight a couple of parts that help us think about rhetorical responsibility. So right away in the second paragraph, she writes, "A popular view of rhetoric is that it is a straightforward model of how communication should work. A person can speak the truth simply by using words that refer to true things in the world. If she chooses not to use sentences filled with words that refer to true things, then she's engaged in rhetoric." So here the misconception that Roberts Miller is talking about is if we're just very plain and straightforward, that seems to be truthful. And then if people talk about things in more figurative ways or using maybe more advanced vocabulary, then sometimes some people think that rhetoric is that kind of more fancy, obscuring version. What she goes on to say, though, and to talk about is how we are always engaging in rhetoric. Even making the choice to speak very plainly is a rhetorical decision. And so we have to think about what kind of rhetoric we're engaging in. So that's one of her overall points. But she's kind of getting at here this idea that some people think rhetorical responsibility is in being clear. Roberts Miller would probably think that rhetorical responsibility is something a little more complicated than that. That maybe it's understanding how you're choosing to use rhetoric in your situation. But it's not, certainly not, ascribing to the idea that everything has to be very simple and factual. In the conclusion, she starts to develop this extended example of the decision to use metaphors of disease for groups we don't like. So this would be an example, I think, of something that she says is not responsible. Let me read from that for a second. For instance, we might be tempted to use metaphors of disease Oh, let me back up. She writes here, rhetoric isn't always good and it isn't always bad, but it's rarely neutral. For instance, we might be tempted to use metaphors of disease, infection, or contamination for those groups that we don't like. That might be a calculated decision to mislead an audience. We might not dislike the groups as vehemently as we project, but we still perform for the audience to get votes, money, popularity, sales, sex, or something else. It is insincere. These types of people might make us feel unsettled and disgusted. They might come across to us as dangerous, blah, 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 blah. And she's really highlighting, I mean, she's trying, I think, when I read this, I think she's reflecting a lot of the language that we hear on a regular basis, that people talk this way about other groups in our country, and we see language like this on social media, and then we see people arguing about it. We hear it in more public presentations, and it stirs up a lot of feelings. And it stirs up a lot of feelings because of, not only because of this, but one of the reasons it stirs up a lot of feelings is because it is because it has real consequences. So at the end here, she says, it can hurt us as a community because it can mean that we then interpret that group's actions through a lens of disease, threat, and danger. We can end up killing them or getting them killed because of the rhetoric we used. So in that statement right there, and she's certainly trying to end very powerfully and pointing to some of the irresponsible, dangerous language that we hear about about groups on a regular basis in 2019. But here, her point is that we need to carefully choose the kind of rhetoric we use because it has actual implications on other people's lives. Okay, so there is another place we can look to think about rhetorical responsibility. We can also think about how some of the things that we've read for class help us think about responsibility. For example, let's look back at the Hanlon text that we read during week 1. So when I think back to this text, I think about how Hanlon is working to both respond to writers or public speakers who have suggested that highlighting someone's feelings is not as valid as logic and evidence, by saying that those feelings are part of the evidence. They're related to real events in that person's life, and those events have consequences, and sometimes those consequences manifest in particular feelings, so that actually reason versus emotion is a false dichotomy. When I think about Aaron Hanlon's text, I'm thinking about how part of responsible rhetoric is attending to those emotions that somebody's presenting when they're speaking. And rather than just brushing them off as only emotion, thinking about how that emotion matters in why the person is presenting what they're saying to you, whether and how you might even respond to that emotion, but really like understanding that they are presenting it to you for a reason, and not just to be merely emotional. Okay, so let's look at the directions for the final section of Project 1. You've already written the descriptions and analysis sections, and now I want a reflection section at the end. Explain how this article, your analysis of it, and any other reading you've done for class so far help you begin to compose a definition of responsible rhetoric. So I just talked about a number of things. You might have noticed some other things based on the article that you are reading, or maybe you noticed other things in the pieces that I just talked about that I didn't address. And so you can cite other texts. You can, in this reflection section, if you want to cite the Roberts Miller text or Aaron Hanlon's text or any of the other chapters that we read as a class, you can do that. Then I want you to explain how this definition helps you think about the research, writing, and presenting work you will do for our class. So I'm asking you specifically to take your definition and apply it to thinking forward, to kind of planning or being metacognitive about how that working definition, and I'll call it a working definition because it'll probably continue to develop, will impact what you do in this writing class as a student writer who's working with other student writers. Okay, so that's all I really want to say about that. We'll talk a lot more about this definition over the course of this semester, but I hope that that helped you get thinking about how you might begin to develop that definition.